David was the kind of man who always carried a spare tire, a portable jump starter, and a comprehensive first aid kit in his SUV. At 40 years old, he had built a life in Ohio centered on the principles of readiness and quiet responsibility. He was a pillar of his community, a dedicated father who firmly believed that being prepared for the worst allowed you to enjoy the best. After a grueling year of corporate restructuring and endless 60-hour work weeks, David felt the cracks showing. He needed a true escape for Sarah and the kids, a dream vacation to finally reconnect as a family away from the stress of home. He chose a vibrant nation in Southeast Asia, never imagining that his nature as a prepared family man would be his ultimate downfall. While packing in the safety of their quiet Ohio suburb, David tucked a professional-grade multi-tool into the side pocket of his tactical backpack. It was a foldable gadget he'd use countless times to fix broken toys or open heavy packages. Next to it, he placed a fresh, unopened box of high-strength allergy medication. In America, these were simple grocery store staples, symbols of suburban convenience and self-reliance. It was a symbol of his role as the family protector, the man who could handle any minor crisis. He checked his passport, patted his children's heads, and led his family toward the airport, entirely unaware that he was carrying items that the strict local laws of their destination viewed with extreme suspicion and criminal intent. He felt proud of his preparation, believing these small tools would keep his family safe during their journey. The flight was long, filled with the restless excitement of the children and Sarah's visible relief as the Midwest faded behind them. When they finally landed, the humid air of the peninsula hit them like a physical weight. The airport was a gleaming monument of glass and polished steel, maintained with an almost obsessive level of cleanliness. David felt a sense of awe, but his seasonal allergies immediately flared in the new environment. He reached for his bag, intending to take a pill as soon as they cleared the customs checkpoint. The line moved with rhythmic military precision. There was a silence in the terminal that felt much heavier and more imposing than the quiet back in Ohio. Rules here weren't just helpful guidelines, they were the absolute foundation of social existence. As David placed his backpack on the conveyor belt, he shared a playful smile with his young daughter. He was already thinking about the hotel pool and the exotic food tours their guide had promised, but the smile faded when the technician suddenly squinted at the monitor, his posture stiffening. A red button was pressed on the console, and the belt stopped with a jarring metallic thud. Two officers in dark uniforms stepped forward from the shadows. One pointed directly at David. He felt a sharp prickle of confusion rather than immediate fear. He was a father from Ohio, a law-abiding citizen. He stepped toward the inspection table, his heart beginning to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs as the atmosphere in the room changed. His palms began to sweat against the cool surface. "Is this yours?" the officer asked flatly, his eyes cold and unblinking. He held up the multi-tool, its stainless steel blade catching the harsh light of the inspection room. Then, with a slow movement, he produced the box of allergy medicine. David nodded quickly, trying to maintain a polite tone. He explained the medicine was for hay fever, and the tool was for minor, everyday repairs. He spoke as if he were talking to a neighbor, expecting a simple shrug and a nod of understanding. Instead, the officers exchanged a look of grim significance. In this jurisdiction, the common decongestant was a controlled substance used in illicit manufacturing. The multi-tool was classified not as a gadget, but as a prohibited weapon. David's heart sank as he realized his simple explanations were falling on stone-cold ears. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The transition from tourist to criminal happened in mere seconds. The family vacation evaporated, replaced by the sterile, suffocating terror of a foreign police state. Sarah reached for his hand, but was barked back by an officer who stepped between them. The children began to cry, their faces twisting in a confusion David realized he could no longer soothe. He was forced into a hard chair, and heavy metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The cold steel felt alien against his skin. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. David looked up as the lead customs officer leaned down, his face only inches away. The man spoke in a chilling whisper that promised no mercy. "In your country, this is medicine and a simple toy. In mine, this is 15 years in prison." But the transition from the gleaming airport to the detention center felt like a descent into an industrial nightmare. The walls were not the drywall and eggshell paint of Ohio. They were rough, unsealed concrete that seemed to sweat in the stifling humidity. In his small cell, David sat on a wooden bench, The kind of furniture that punished the body for simply existing. The light above him was a single, flickering fluorescent tube that hummed with a persistent, low-frequency buzz, vibrating through his skull. Back home, David would have checked the wiring or suggested an LED replacement. Here, he was just another body in a system designed for total containment. The silence of the facility was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic clanging of heavy steel doors and the sharp, clipped commands of guards shifting posts. It was a sterile, unforgiving world where his identity as a provider and a protector had been stripped away, replaced by a serial number on a yellow jumpsuit. When the local lawyer finally arrived, David felt a momentary surge of relief. He leaned forward, his voice hushed but urgent, speaking of the Fourth Amendment, of unreasonable search and seizure, and the inherent right to bear tools for self-defense back in America. He spoke as if these were universal truths, laws of physics that applied everywhere. But the lawyer, a man with tired eyes and a suit that smelled of stale cigarettes, did not look impressed. Instead, he let out a dry, rattling laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. To him, David's American logic sounded like a child explaining the rules of a game to a professional soldier. He told David that his amendment stopped at the ocean's edge. He explained that in this nation, the collective safety of the state outweighed any individual's desire for privacy or preparation. There was no Second Amendment here to justify a blade, and no privacy laws to protect what was hidden in a bag. The concept of free speech was treated not as a virtue, but as a potential seed of rebellion that needed to be pruned before it could grow. The betrayal, however, was what cut the deepest into David's spirit. He had spent weeks communicating with a local tour guide, a man who had promised to show them the hidden gems of the city. They had exchanged friendly emails about local customs and the best spots for the children. David had even tipped him in advance as a gesture of goodwill. But as the interrogation continued, the truth emerged with agonizing clarity. The tour guide had not just been a facilitator, he was a silent observer for the state. He had seen David's suspiciously well-organized gear and the various American medications during their initial meeting at the arrivals gate and had immediately flagged him to the authorities. In this country, the government encouraged a culture of surveillance, offering whistleblower rewards to citizens who reported irregularities. The guide had seen David not as a guest, but as a payday. The very person David had trusted to protect his family was the one who had ensured their ruin, trading David's freedom for a handful of local currency. This was the reality of a world without American-style privacy laws. While David lived in a country where the concept of government surveillance was a fictional warning, here it was a social contract. The government saw everything because the citizens showed them everything. The state's eyes were the eyes of your neighbor, your taxi driver, and your guide. There was no expectation of a private sphere. David realized with a jolt of terror that the self-defense culture he was so proud of, the idea that a man should be armed and ready to handle his own problems, was viewed here as the ultimate threat to the state's monopoly on power. To carry a tool was to suggest the government's protection was not enough. To carry unverified pills was to bypass the state's control over the body. Outside the heavy walls, Sarah was drowning in a different kind of nightmare. She stood in the lobby of their high-end hotel, clutching her American passport like a talisman. She had tried to reach the embassy. She had tried to demand to see her husband, but the responses were always the same: polite, cold, and utterly unyielding. A local official had told her bluntly that her blue passport did not grant her husband immunity from local sovereignty. The American flag on the cover did not erase the laws of the soil they stood on. She watched her children huddled on the hotel sofa, their dream vacation now a terrifying waiting game. The sense of American entitlement she had carried her whole life was shattering. She was beginning to realize that the world did not revolve around her expectations of fairness. It revolved around the iron will of the local magistrate. The day ended with a chilling finality. As Sarah returned to her room, her hands shaking as she tried to manage the kids, she noticed a small, cream-colored envelope slipped under the door. There was no stamp and no return address. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tore it open. Inside was a single typed sentence that felt like a death sentence to her hope. The law here doesn't care about your rights, only your submission. The silence of the cell was heavier than the humidity outside, a physical weight that pressed against David's chest for the first time in his 40 years. The bravado of his suburban life, the confidence that came from the sturdy scaffolding of knowing his rights, his insurance policies, and his place in a predictable world began to dissolve like salt in a storm. He sat on the edge of the wooden bench, staring at the scarred concrete, realizing that his American entitlement held no value here. Back in Ohio, he was a man who demanded to speak to managers if a service was slow or if a rule felt unfair. Here he was a ghost in a machine that didn't care if he existed. The realization was a slow, agonizing poison, eroding the foundation of who he believed he was. His mind drifted to a painful montage of the life he had left behind, snapshots that now felt like scenes from a forbidden movie. He saw himself at a big box store, casually tossing a 500-count bottle of painkillers into a cart without a second thought. In America, it was a mundane errand to save $5 on the sheer volume of his life's mundane choices. Here it was viewed as a shipment of illicit narcotics meant for the black market. He remembered driving his SUV, making a right turn on a red light, a maneuver so second nature he didn't even process it as a legal privilege. In this city, such an act was a flagrant violation of the traffic code, met with immediate punishment. Even his loud debates at the diner about the government felt like a memory from another planet. In Ohio, complaining was a birthright. Here, it was a one-way ticket to a permanent disappearance. While David wrestled with his inner collapse, Sarah was facing her own trial on the streets. She stepped out of the hotel lobby, the sunlight blinding against her mounting anxiety. The constant hum of city drones and security cameras followed her every move. She watched a man stop by an officer for discarding chewing gum onto the pavement. In her world, gum was a triviality. Here it was a pollutant that carried a heavy fine and a criminal record. She stood at a crosswalk, waiting for the signal even when the road was empty, paralyzed by the fear that jaywalking could result in her being dragged into the cell next to her husband. She realized that the liberty she took for granted wasn't just about voting. It was the invisible freedom to be messy and human without state intervention. The city was pristine, but the perfection felt like a threat to her very existence. In the afternoon, a new presence entered David's world. The heavy steel door groaned, and a thin, academic-looking man was pushed inside. This was the fellow inmate, a local whose eyes carried a look of weary resignation. David learned the man's crime was homeschooling his 3 children. David thought of his sister in Cincinnati, who taught her kids at the kitchen table, proud of her educational independence. Here, such an act was a criminal offense, a challenge to the state's monopoly on the education of the youth. The inmate explained that the government viewed homeschooling as a dangerous form of isolationism that threatened the very fabric of national unity and social cohesion. The realization hit David with the force of a blow. The values he cherished, self-reliance, private education, and personal freedom, were the things that made him a villain here. The inmate leaned closer, speaking of the hearing of truth and the proceeding that would decide David's fate. There is no room for pride here. He warned that the judges wouldn't want a legal defense or an explanation of American customs. They would be looking for total contrition and the absolute abandonment of the American ego. The inmate's final words chilled David to the bone. Tomorrow is the hearing of truth. If you speak like an American, demanding your rights, you will never leave this place. You must stop being a citizen of your country and become a servant of ours. The inmate's words lingered in the stagnant cell, a warning that stripped David of his remaining defiance. He realized the tools he used to navigate conflict, his voice, his confidence, his demand for logic, were useless here. In Ohio, he would have called a lawyer or rallied neighbors. Here, those actions were stones thrown at a fortress. David studied the guards. He watched how they moved with a precise grace and spoke in measured tones that betrayed no emotion. He mimicked them, practicing a language of respect that felt foreign on his tongue. It was a strategy for survival, a decision to shed the American ego that had served him well in the suburbs but was now a glowing target. He realized speaking up was seen here not as courage, but as a lack of discipline. The door groaned open, admitting the prosecutor. The man was impeccably dressed, his sharp suit contrasting with the grime of the center. He didn't come with formal charges, but with a document and a predatory smile. Placing a fountain pen on the bolted table, he offered David a way out. The document was a detailed admission of espionage, claiming David was an operative sent to gather intelligence. The prosecutor explained that the country thrived on resisting American influence. If David signed, he would be expelled immediately, a political win for the state and a ticket home for David. It was a transaction of souls, turning a customs violation into a triumph of national security that would echo in their news for weeks. This presented a soul-crushing moral dilemma that gnawed at his conscience. To sign was to lie, betraying the fundamental integrity he had spent 40 years building. To refuse was to face a system designed to crush dissent, with no guarantee of seeing his children again. David's American values of truth clashed with his basic instinct for self-preservation. He thought of his grandfather, a veteran who believed a man's word was his bond and his name was his legacy. Could he look his son in the eye if his freedom was bought with a fraudulent and shameful signature? The prosecutor watched with cold, predatory patience, knowing the psychological weight of a lie was as heavy as a prison sentence. As he contemplated the choice, David's mind drifted to the profound differences in how their cultures viewed the essence of human life. In America, he was used to at-will employment, where freedom meant the right to quit and value his own time above all else. It was a system built on individual mobility and ambition. Here, the law dictated a job for life mentality, where the state provided security in exchange for lifelong loyalty and total obedience. This society didn't value the individual's time. Time belonged to the collective purpose. This was why his American excess was so deeply offensive to their sensibilities. He was a symbol of a world that valued the person over the institution, a concept the prosecutor viewed as a dangerous disease. In the quiet moments after the prosecutor left him, David felt the crushing absence of the protections he had always taken for granted. Back home, habeas corpus was just an abstract legal concept from a civics class. Now, the right to be shown the evidence against him felt like the most precious gift on earth. The right to a jury was a luxury he had never truly appreciated until it was gone. He realized the American legal system was built on the fragile assumption of innocence. Here, the state was always right, and the individual's role was to harmonize with that truth or be discarded. Meanwhile, Sarah was sequestered in her hotel room with the tour guide's mother, who felt deep shame for her son's betrayal. They discovered a faint glimmer of hope, an ancient maritime treaty that offered immunity under specific circumstances. However, the loophole came with a catch. To invoke it, the family had to forfeit all assets and pay a purification fee that would effectively bankrupt them. Sarah looked at her sleeping children, realizing that their home in Ohio and their very future was the price of David's pulse. She knew the life they had built together was being dismantled to save the man who was its very heart. The morning of the hearing of truth arrived with a chilling lack of fanfare. David was led through sterile corridors that smelled of industrial floor wax. There was no grand entrance, only a small side door that deposited him into a wooden box at the center of a vast, high-ceilinged room. He looked up and saw no jury of his peers. Instead, elevated on a mahogany dais, sat 3 judges. Their faces were carved from the same hard stone as the laws they upheld. The head judge, a man whose hair was pulled back in a tight, severe knot, looked down at David as a deviation from the national harmony that required correction. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy vacuum that made David's heartbeat sound like a drum in his ears. The prosecutor began his opening statement with a measured, rhythmic cadence that felt more like a religious sermon than a legal argument. He didn't focus on the composition of the allergy medication or the length of the tool's blade. Instead, he presented a slideshow of David's life in Ohio, curated from social media and seized electronics. There were photos of David's 2-car garage, his oversized lawn, and the rows of bottles in his medicine cabinet. The prosecutor pointed to these images as evidence of American excess and a culture of decadence that bred lawlessness. He argued that a man who required so many tools and so much medicine was a man who had lost his inner discipline, relying on external crutches rather than the strength of the state. To the judges, David's preparedness was not a virtue but a symptom of a chaotic society that prioritized the comfort of the individual over the order of the collective. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Sarah walked in slowly, her face pale but her eyes burning with a desperate fire. She was not accompanied by a lawyer or an embassy official. Beside her was the elderly mother of the tour guide who had betrayed them. Behind them, looking small and ashamed, followed the tour guide himself. A murmur rippled through the gallery of state observers as they realized this was not a legal challenge, but a moral one. The tour guide who had betrayed David for government credits now moved toward the witness stand, spurred by his mother's refusal to let her family's legacy be built on the bones of an innocent man's freedom. When the tour guide spoke, his voice was shaky, but he did not falter. He began to describe his time in America, explaining the context of the items found in David's bag. He spoke of the American Midwest, where a multi-tool was a symbol of self-reliance. He explained that the medicine David carried was sold in every grocery store, meant to help a father play with his children in the grass without suffering. He was attempting to build a bridge across an ocean of misunderstanding, trying to show the judges that David's decadence was simply the normalcy of a different world. He spoke of his own shame, Admitting his betrayal was born of a fear he no longer wished to carry. It was an attempt to make the foreign familiar. The head judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he dismissed the tour guide. He didn't care about the grocery stores of Ohio. His gaze locked onto David, piercing through the man's exhaustion. The judge's voice was a low, resonant rumble. He demanded to know why David believed his American ways were superior. Why did he think he could bring the tools of his chaotic culture into a land of order? Why did he believe his personal needs outweighed the sanctity of local law? David felt the eyes of his wife and the weight of his children's futures. He stood up slowly, his back straight. He looked the head judge directly in the eye, drawing a deep, steady breath as he prepared to deliver the very speech of his life. David stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, feeling the rough texture of the wooden railing under his fingertips. He looked past the prosecutor, whose face was a mask of calculated coldness, and focused entirely on the head judge. When he spoke, his voice did not carry the booming confidence of an American demanding his rights. Instead, it was soft, freighted with the heavy realization that his identity was being dismantled piece by piece. He didn't speak of the Second Amendment or the nuances of international law. He spoke of the universal language of a parent's anxiety. He told the judges about the small moments back in Ohio, fixing a broken kitchen cabinet for his wife, or helping his son assemble a science project, where the tools in his bag were symbols of care, not of chaos. He spoke about how, in his home, being prepared was the highest form of love a father could show. He pivoted then, his words weaving a bridge between two vastly different ideologies. He described the American dream as a tapestry of individual threads, often messy and loud, but vibrant because every thread was allowed to find its own path. He contrasted this with the dream he saw reflected in the eyes of the people here, the beauty of the collective, the serenity of a society that valued order and harmony above the whims of the individual. He didn't call one better than the other. He simply admitted that he had been a traveler who forgot to check his compass, a man who had brought the noise of his world into a place of sacred silence. He spoke of his ignorance not as an excuse, but as a profound failure of respect, a plea for mercy that resonated more deeply than any legal defense could have. Sarah watched him from the gallery, her breath held in her throat, seeing the man she loved strip away his pride until only his humanity remained. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to shift, the rigid tensions softening just enough to offer a glimpse of hope. Even the elderly mother of the tour guide nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in David's voice. But the prosecutor was not moved by sentiment. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his dark suit, and held up a digital tablet that glowed like a predatory eye in the dim room. He began to scroll through a history that David had buried under 3 years of domestic life. He read aloud a series of social media posts David had written from his living room in Ohio, long before this vacation was even a thought. In those posts, David had been sharp and mocking, criticizing the very laws that now held him captive. He had called the nation's governance archaic and its restrictions an affront to human dignity. In the United States, those words were nothing, a drop of digital ink in an ocean of free speech. But here, the prosecutor argued, they were a crime of extraterritoriality. He claimed that David's American freedom was a weapon he had been using against their culture long before he stepped onto their soil. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The freedom David had enjoyed back home, the right to speak his mind without fear of the state, had become his greatest enemy abroad. It was the ultimate irony. The very liberty that defined him as an American was now being used to prove he was a threat to the local order. The prosecutor argued that David hadn't brought medicine and tools by accident. He had brought the arrogant spirit of a man who believed his voice mattered more than a nation's sovereignty. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from David's lungs. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of genuine terror in her eyes. The legal loophole she had found felt fragile and distant now. The head judge didn't look angry, he looked resolved. He leaned back in his high chair, the shadows of the dais swallowing his features. He watched David with a piercing, clinical gaze, as if studying a specimen that had finally revealed its true nature. The cultural gap, which the tour guide had tried to bridge with stories of grocery stores and bicycles, had just widened into an uncrossable chasm. The head judge slowly reached for his gavel, his movements deliberate and heavy with the weight of centuries of tradition. He raised the dark wood high above the bench. He told David that in America he was a citizen, but here he was merely a guest who had broken the house rules. The gavel descended with a finality that seemed to shatter the very air in the courtroom, the sharp crack echoing off the stone walls like a gunshot while the cold wood of the bench felt distant and strange. David flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for a 15-year sentence to crush his life and family forever. But the head judge did not speak of prison. His voice carried a weary, almost regretful authority that seemed to transcend the harshness of the prosecutor's cold tone. He spoke of the bridge the tour guide had attempted to build and the mercy requested by the elderly mother who had stood for justice. He announced a conditional release. David was to be deported immediately and banned for life from ever returning to their shores. The relief was not a sudden burst of joy, but a slow, agonizing drain of tension that left David's knees trembling. He was free, but the cost was total erasure from this land, a mark that would follow him across every future border he might ever try to cross. The transition to the airport was a blur of black sedans and stern-faced officials who moved with clockwork precision. Sarah was there, her face a map of exhaustion and tear-streaked relief, holding their children tightly as if they might vanish if she let go. There were no long goodbyes, and certainly no apologies from the state for the terror they had endured. There was only the cold efficiency of a sovereign power correcting a cultural mistake. David was escorted through a side entrance of the terminal, bypassing the glitzy duty-free shops and the bustling crowds of tourists who were blissfully unaware of the shadows lurking beneath the surface of this paradise. He felt the eyes of the authorities on his back until the very moment he stepped onto the jet bridge. It wasn't until he sank into his seat that the reality finally settled. The air inside the cabin smelled of sterile plastic and recycled air, yet it was the sweetest thing he had ever inhaled. As the plane taxied toward the runway, David watched the humid landscape recede into a patchwork of green and gray. As the wheels left the ground and the pressurized cabin hummed with the sound of altitude, the physical weight that had sat on David's chest finally lifted. He looked at the small plastic bag the authorities had returned to him just before boarding. Inside were the mundane artifacts of his American life. The small multi-tool and the blister pack of allergy medication. In Ohio, these were the invisible tools of a suburban father, items bought for a few dollars at a local pharmacy without a second thought. Here, they had been the catalyst for an international incident, symbols of a cultural arrogance he hadn't even known he possessed. He realized then that these objects were more than just tools. They were symbols of a very specific, incredibly fragile kind of liberty that only existed within the borders of his home. He thought back to the inmate he had met, the man arrested for homeschooling who merely wanted to be the primary architect of his children's minds. He thought of the right to turn on red and the loud, boisterous political debates he'd had at 4th of July barbecues. In the American bubble, these things were as natural as breathing, a birthright so pervasive that it became invisible. But the world, he now understood, was much larger and far less forgiving than the sunny suburbs of the Midwest. The normalcy he had clung to was a regional dialect of freedom, one that didn't translate across the vast oceans of different histories and values. He had walked into a house with its own rules, assuming his own rules were universal, and he had nearly lost his life because of that assumption. The flight was a suspension of time between the nightmare he was leaving and the life he was reclaiming. He spent hours watching his children sleep, their faces finally peaceful and no longer clouded by the confusion of seeing their father led away in chains. He reached out and touched Sarah's hand, finding a strength in her grip that had been forged in the fire of the last few weeks. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was full of a new, somber understanding. They were returning to a world of at-will employment, jury trials, and grocery store aisles filled with unregulated pills. A world that suddenly felt both miraculous and terrifyingly loose. He realized that the American bubble could be a dangerous place if one forgot that the rest of the world operated on a different clock. When the pilot finally announced their descent into the United States, a collective breath seemed to leave the family. They cleared customs in a hall that looked remarkably like the one where his ordeal began, but the air felt lighter and the faces less severe. As they walked through the sliding glass doors of the arrivals terminal, David stopped. The neon lights of the terminal glowed with a kitschy, familiar warmth, and a large, hand-painted sign held by his family fluttered in the breeze. He looked at the police officers chatting casually with travelers, their presence a background hum of safety rather than an omnipresent threat of judgment. David finally understood what home of the brave truly meant. It wasn't just about military strength or bravado. It was the luxury of living in a place where you had the right to be wrong, the right to be prepared, and the right to speak your mind without losing your life. He pulled his children into a crushing embrace, a traveler who had finally learned that the greatest American luxury wasn't a product on a shelf, but the simple right to exist without fear.